Alright, next up I'm going to be stringing up a 2018 Pure Drive. And I've strung rackets like this before. There's not going to be anything overly new here other than I'm going to show you how you can use a set of string. If you're, let's say you're trying out different strings and you might try out a string and then possibly buy a reel of it later, how to figure out how much you need to be cutting off of your reels, or in other words, how to conserve string. Well, you can use, if you're working with a set of string, it's already a given length, and in most cases, unless you're using an 18 by 20, a racket with an 1820 pattern, or an oversized racket maybe with an 1820 pattern, you're probably not going to need every little bit of string that's in here. This is a 100 square inch hoop, it's a 16 by 19 racket, so I know that there's going to be more than enough string in here. You're going to be throwing away, whatever you snip off of the ends, you're going to be throwing away, and you can't conserve it anyway. It's a pack. But when it comes to reels, if you know that you only need 34 feet of string to string this racket, you want to be cutting off 34 feet off of your reels, not 40 feet or 39 feet. So if you're trying out a string, or if you're going through packs of string, you can do some measuring, both measure the pack. Don't assume that it's 40 feet. I've mentioned this many times in the threads on the tennis forum, as well as on some of my videos. Don't take it for granted that there's 40 feet of string in here. It could be a little less, it could be a little bit more, and it's going to be important when it comes to the math in calculating. You're taking into your account whatever excess you have at the end, subtracting that from what you started with. So we're actually going to measure this and see if it's 40 feet, or if it's 39 and a half, or if it's 40 and 9 inches, or whatever. But since there's more than enough string here, by measuring what we have extra, we'll be able to do the calculation to figure out exactly to the inch how much string you need to cut off your reel. And before I go any further, an important part of doing your calculations is you need to know the distance from the edge of your frame to the back of your tension head, or the back of your gripper specifically. Now I have a linear gripper here, and for my final pulls I don't go around the Diablo because that would require an additional 3 inches to go around that. And I know that it requires about 12 inches to go from the edge of a mounted frame for final pulls. So maybe if you're stringing it 2-piece, so the outer, go from the grommet, where the outer main would be exiting on each side, to measure that how long that piece of string needs to be to reach the back of your gripper. If you've got a rotational gripper, it's going to probably need more string length than if you have a linear gripper. If you have a crank machine and you can bring the crank and the jaws or the gripper really close, you might need less string. So I know that I need 12 inches from the frame to reach the back of my gripper for my machine. So make sure you know how much. If you have a drop weight, like a gamma drop weight, progression 200 or an X2 or an X6 or something like that, with those rotational grippers, or even some of the electronics have a rotational gripper, measure how much string you need to do that. I think on the drop weights you need about 20 inches. 18 or 20 inches, something like that. So it's quite a bit more, at least 6 inches, maybe 8 inches longer than I need for my setup. So you need to know that, because you're going to take that into account. At any rate, so I'm not going to be pulling string off of the reel. Actually, the client gave me this string. It's actually a different gauge and a different color. This is the blue version of Alu Power, and it's also a slightly different gauge. So, but we can use the information from stringing this racket 2-piece with this to discern how much we would need to cut off of our reels, whether we're going to string it 2-piece or 1-piece the next time round. And I am going to string this 2-piece. The main reason for that is I've already been given way more string than I need. Stringing this with a 1-piece pattern or a around the world pattern, as I normally would, won't conserve me any string. I'm going to be throwing away whatever excess is left out of this pack, so there's no real need to try to conserve some string. But now when I normally string this racket, and I am pulling from reels, I do cut off 34 feet, 33 and a half feet to string this racket, because I'm going to string it 1-piece. And if you're going to string this racket 1-piece, for those of you who might be trying to string this racket 1-piece, if you're familiar with my so-called golden rule of 1-piece stringing that I've mentioned in a number of my other videos, and if you haven't, go check that out. It has to do with, my golden rule is about the transitions when you move from a main to a cross, or from a cross to a main. And when you're doing around the world patterns, there's at least one or more places where you're going to transition from a cross to a main or a main to a cross. And you want to make sure that there's a substantial amount of graphite between the two grommets involved to support those transitions. So you can go look that up or watch some of my other videos where I've covered that. But for this racket, it's very much like a Babolat Pure Arrow. It's got the double skips, 7 and 9 head, 7 and 9 throat. The mains tie off here at 8 throat when you're stringing it 2-piece. The top cross ties off at 6 head, which is actually designated up here, and the bottom cross ties off at 6 throat. So your tie-offs are 8 and 8 for your mains, 6 and 6 for your crosses when you're doing it 2-piece. When I string this 1-piece, due to the transitions that are involved, I would not recommend you use a Parnell around the world on this, because there'll be a 270-degree transition between this outer main and the third from bottom cross. I wouldn't use a box pattern on this where you go around 3 times. I also would not care for the UK RS8 around the world pattern on this racket for the same reason. The short side would take care of the short side plus 2 bottom crosses, meaning the long side would have to do a transition from the third cross from the bottom to the outer main, another 270-degree turn over here where these grommets are a little close. I mean, they're not super on top of each other, but there's 3 around the world patterns that all do work well on this, and none of them would require a 270-degree turn through the frame. So all of the transitions, in addition to having a substantial amount of graphite to support them, would also just be nice, kind 90-degree transitions instead of having to make a 270-degree turn. So the universal around the world pattern works great on this racket. The short side around the world pattern works great on this racket. The Dire Desire around the world pattern works well on this racket as well. All 3 of those are very good candidates. I just wouldn't go a box pattern. I wouldn't go UK RSA on it. And let me take a quick peek at it. If you don't have a starting clamp and you wanted to use an around the world pattern, the generic around the world pattern that doesn't require a starting clamp would have you transition to the second. That transition's fine. Do all the mains. The 19th would finish here. Outer main to the top cross would be fine. So you could do the generic around the world pattern if you don't own a starting clamp. The downside of that pattern is you would have 8 mains installed on one side of the racket but only 7 on the other as you're doing all the crosses, and you would fill in this missing outer main at the end. So there would be a slight imbalance in that this main was installed early without the intersections of the crosses, and this one would be installed late with the intersection of the crosses. Also, the last 2 strings that would get tied off would be the outer main on the short side would get tied off, so you'd have a slight tension loss on this outer main, and then the top cross would be the last string done with the long side, so it would be a slight tension loss. So your 2 final strings before tying off would be the upper or top cross and an outer main, as opposed to the top and bottom cross or the top cross and the 18th cross like most of the around the world patterns. So if you want to do an ATW on this, look into the universal around the world pattern, the Dire Desire around the world pattern, or the short side around the world pattern. Those are all very good if you have a starting clamp. But we're going to do a very simple 2-piece string job on this, and first we'll measure how much string we have here to see what the total length is before we get started. We'll then measure off probably 19 feet or possibly 20 feet for the mains, even though I know that that's going to be well more than I need. You know, if I was actually cutting from a reel, I'd probably be using 19 feet, maybe even 18 feet 9 inches for the mains on this racket. So, but pretend you don't know any of that. That's where experience and doing, you know, different frames and keeping a stringing log where you can go back and look at another frame that's of a similar hoop size with the same pattern, whether it's a 18-19 or a 16-19 or 18-6. You have all these different patterns, and once you've done enough rackets and you keep a thorough stringing log, you can go back and reference those and see, you know, oh, here's a racket that I did. It's got the same string pattern. It's also a polyester. These are the lengths I used. This is how much overage I had, if any. And you can get very, very close to what you need without having to cut off excessive amounts off of your reels. Obviously, it goes without saying, or should go without saying, if you're not cutting from reels and you're always using packs of string, there's no point in conserving anything because it all gets thrown away. You're not leaving any to use for the next time and the next time. So, first I'm going to measure this string off by using racquet lengths, and then plus however many extra inches we have. And when I say racquet length, I'm talking about 27 inches. So 27 inches with this racquet mounted comes to right here. So that's the spot that I'll be using. My reference point visually is right here, because that's 27 inches from the butt cap. I do this because sometimes you might mount a racket and it might be, some rackets are 27.5 inches or 28 inches or even longer. It might be a short racket, could be a junior racket, 26 inches or 25. So when I say racket length, I'm talking about a 27-inch increment. So that's why every time I'm about to measure, I'll pull out the measuring tape to see where exactly 27 inches lies over here. So let's open up this pack. And take out our set of string, and I'll show you a little tip on how to uncoil this. So now most string sets, when you open it up, will have one of these bands. This happens to have two. So I'll show you actually two methods. One method is you don't really want to go at this and try to put your snips or your cutters underneath that band, because you could nick the string. Now this is a polyester string, so it's unlikely that I'm going to nick it. But if this was a delicate multi-filament or natural gut comes packaged this way, there's no way I'm going to go sticking these sharp snips underneath that band and possibly nick a delicate multi-filament or a natural gut. So what I do, I'll show you in a moment. Since there's two bands here, I'll show you two methods. One method is grab your needle nose pliers or your bent nose needle nose pliers, and if you grab the tab here where the zip tie fed through itself, if you grab this way from the side and then just twist it, hold the strings tightly and give this a twist sharply, usually it'll break the band. Now that one didn't break straight away, but if you twist it a couple times, it should come off. And so usually it comes off a little easier than that. So that's one method, is to grab this from the side and twist until the band breaks over here, and that way you don't actually damage the string itself. The second method is the one I actually use most of the time, which is, again, there's usually just one band on here. So what I do is I find one of the ends of the string. So let's say this end right here. And I want to pull that out. Well, how do you figure out which of these strands over here is this one? You just pull this a little bit, and that loop started to get smaller. So I'm going to pull this strand over here to remove that. And then I'm just going to push this string through. So what I want to do is I want to remove a few coils like this. And now this is getting looser. It's not so tight. And after you remove a few of them, and actually at some point it becomes easier to just hold on to the band and turn the entire spool. So I'm basically unwinding it in my hand and sliding this along the circle. But I'm holding this still and I'm rotating all of the string. So as I do this, more of it is feeding off right here, and this is getting looser. And so eventually this gets loose enough to where there's a healthy gap there that you can then slide your snips underneath that without risking hitting any of the other strands of the string, and then you can snip it. Or you can just continue sliding this along, unwinding it slowly, and then you don't get any crazy bird's nest in your hands. When if you snip this off and you let go of this, you might have a big mess on your hands that you then have to sort out. So what I usually do is, after I get a couple feet pulled off, I like to know where the ends are, because if you secure the ends somewhere, either put a starting clamp on there and put it on the floor, or if you take this and put it inside of one of your clamps to where it can't go anywhere, now you can't get a knot. It's impossible for a knot to form when you've got the two ends secured somewhere. So if you just keep unwinding this, it's continuing to unspool. Basically, you're doing the opposite of the way it was spooled in the factory. And you won't get any crazy nest of string in your hands. It takes a little longer to do it this way, but you're assured of not having a big mess. And you've already secured one of the ends somewhere, and when you get to the other end, again, throw a starting clamp on it, or put it in your other clamp over here so that it can't go anywhere, and then we'll measure that. So let's measure our 27, or let's measure our racquet lengths or 27 inches at a time and see how many we've got. And before I even get started, well, we'll snip the ends in a minute because you're going to want sharp points on these ends. Sets always come with the ends somewhat blunt. So let's see here. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, Okay, so after measuring it off, there was 17 racquet lengths plus an additional length that I had to measure, and it was not yet another racquet length, otherwise it would have been 18 racquet lengths plus something. So it was 17 racquet lengths plus another 23 inches. So 17 racquet lengths would be 38 feet 3 inches. If you add in the extra 23 inches, what that comes out to is 40 feet 2 inches. So this pack of string wasn't exactly 40 feet, it's 40 feet 2 inches. Doesn't sound like it would make a difference, but you'll want to take into account that additional 2 inches at the end. So now we know what we're starting with, 40 feet 2 inches. So I'm going to cut off 20 feet for the mains, which is what you'll commonly find listed for 16 rackets with a 16 by 19 pattern. It might oftentimes say 20 feet for the mains, and that's usually more than you need. Again, this is somewhat dependent on what type of gripper you have, how far away it is, whether it's a string that stretches more or less. But since I know that I'm gonna have more than enough for the mains and more than enough for the crosses, I'll just go ahead and cut 20 feet off for the crosses. We'll measure how much overage there is at the end of the mains. I'll cut 20 feet off for the mains, and we'll measure how much overage there is at the end of the mains, and then we'll use that remaining, 20 foot 2 inch section for the crosses. So let's measure off 20 feet. So the easiest way to do that for me is to measure off 8 racquet lengths, which will be 18 feet, and then just add 24 inches to that. So we want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 racquet lengths, so that's 18 feet. But I don't want 18 feet, I want to use 20. So 2 more feet right there. That's going to be 20 feet. I'm going to cut that sharply at an angle so that both of these strands now have a very sharp point. So this piece is 20 feet 2 inches, and we're going to use that later for our crosses. But this end, which is still a factory end, is very blunt, and I'm going to cut a sharp point onto that, so that later when we use that, both ends of this piece will be very sharp. And likewise, the opposite end, this is the end that I just cut that was connecting the two ends. So now the other side of this, the factory end, still has that blunt tip. I want to cut that off at a very sharp angle. So now I've got a I've got a sharp end on both ends. So this is currently strung up 2-piece with a RPM blast in there. We're going to take this racket and cut out the RPM blast and remount it. This is going to be strung with this Luxilon Alu Power 1.25 in the ice blue color at 53 pounds, both mains and crosses. I've already got the machine set at 53 pounds. So let's get these strings cut out and we'll remount it and get started. Before I take out the last few strings, I'll show you how the knots looked on this racket. I think this was previously strung by Tennis Warehouse. Let's zoom in here. The knots they're just simple double half hitches. Nothing fancy. They didn't use a Wilson Pro knot or a Parnell knot or anything like that. And hopefully you can see this on camera. But the knots are razor sharp. They've left the ends kind of sitting away from the frame with these double half hitches, and the ends are cut at an angle, which is normally what you want to do, but you want that to lay against the frame, and they didn't take the edges off of these at all. These are absolutely, because it's polyester, cut at an angle. Those two ends are razor sharp. So if you snag that with your hand while you're playing, or the inside of the lining of your tennis bag, you're going to rip the lining of your tennis bag as you're putting the racket away or pulling the racket out of the bag. And up here, you'll see that there is just a starting knot. They clearly don't use a starting clamp. So right here, hopefully you can see this big bulky starting knot that they use, because they don't use a starting clamp obviously on their top cross. And the end of it, which has been kind of pulled downward for some reason, I guess maybe they tighten it from underneath the string bed, but that's also razor sharp there. But we won't have a big bulky starting knot like that. That'll be a nice Parnell knot in all 4 of the tie-off locations when I'm done. Butt cap upright for consistency. So regarding those knots that I just showed you, it's not that the knots weren't tied improperly. They just chose to use a starting knot up here instead of a starting clamp to hold the top cross. And so the knots were tied off in the correct locations, and the knots that they used were okay. They were just double half hitches. You could see that the tails were protruding. They weren't laying up against the frame real nice. And there was a little bit of an opening. As a double half hitch sometimes can, the outer hitch can be kind of opening up. So it's not the most tidy looking knot, but it's not incorrect per se. But more importantly, they did tie off at all the correct locations. There were no crossovers on the outside of the frame. So in that regard, everything was done, you know, as you would expect. So let's get started. We've got 20 feet here for our mains. We've got our 20-foot 2-inch piece over here waiting for it to be done for our crosses. So I'm just going to do this the way I normally do a 2-piece string job. So if you've seen me do 2-piece string jobs before, there's not going to be really any revelations here. So we've already got the machine set at 53 pounds, and we won't need to switch it at the midpoint when we transition from doing the mains to the crosses. So let's even up our ends so that at the conclusion of the mains, we should have whatever overage we have on one side, we should have the same amount extra on the other side. And as always, I use the Usuki method for starting my mains. And as always, you'll see me pinching the string right up against the clamp, especially on the first 4 pulls, sometimes the first 6 pulls. This is to ensure that there is absolutely zero slipping in the clamps, because if the string was slipping through the clamps, you wouldn't be able to feel it. I'm sorry, you wouldn't be able to see it, because the string is uniform in smoothness and in color. So if it was sliding slowly through a clamp, you would have no idea unless you actually can do this and feel it when you release the tension head. And of course, it's not slipping. But I always check that at least on the first 4 initial mains, and sometimes I'll do it a few times after those. If you want to see me string this racquet 2-piece with a more thorough commentary, I have a video already out there where I cover all these little things as we go along. So for the most part, I'll just be getting this racquet strung and focusing on the string saving ideas about knowing how much you're starting with and how to calculate at the end your overage, so that later on, if you're using a reel, you'll know exactly how much to use or not use. So now we'll pre-weave the crosses, the top 3 crosses, the way I always do. Since we want the starting knot or the finishing knot to be on this side, we'll put the 3rd cross through first. I install the 3rd, the 2nd, the 1st in terms of installation, but they will be tensioned in their proper order of top down. And then we'll resume with the mains. And to help with the blocked hole issue down here at 7 throat on both sides, when we install the very last string, the bottom cross, that'll be a blocked hole situation. So to make that a little easier to deal with, as always, I will place a ribbon here. As well as one here. And so here's where we're going to measure the overage. So these are our final mains, the 8th main on each side. So if I don't go around the Diablo, because I normally wouldn't, and I come straight to the back of the gripper, there is an extra 7 3/4 inches. Let's just call it 7 1/2 to keep the math simple, but it's actually about 7 3/4. And on the other side, exactly the same, 7 3/4, but let's just call it 7 1/2 and then 7 1/2. So you add 7 1/2 and 7 1/2, that's 15 inches more string than we really needed. So if you take 50, we started with 20 feet for these mains, but we've got 15 inches extra that we really didn't need, so that's 1 foot 3 inches less. If you recall in the beginning, I said I normally would cut about 19 feet or maybe even 18 feet 9 inches for the mains. That's exactly, for my machine and my setup and these distances, 18 feet 9 inches is all I would need to string this racket with this polyester, at least at 53 pounds. Now since I have the extra here, I'll be able to do something I don't normally get to do, which is to use the Diablo for on these final pulls. In fact, when I cut string from the reels, I cut it so that this string is so short that it typically doesn't even reach the back of the gripper, and I'm okay with that. As long as I've got, 8 inches of string here, enough to comfortably tie my Parnell knots, that's the knot that I always use, that's the minimum, that's how much I want to cut off. I don't want to be cutting off any more than that, and so I typically will intentionally be planning ahead, using a shorter length of string and planning to bridge to my tension head with an additional starting clamp, because the string itself won't actually reach the back of the gripper. But in this case, since we've got way too much string, more than we need, I won't have to resort to using this at all. on either of the mains or the crosses. So we'll actually get to use the Diablo for these final pulls. And these tie off, like I said before at the beginning, these tie off down here at 8 throat. And before I actually cinch up my Parnell knot, I will pass another ribbon into this loop here so that the blocked hole situation at 9 throat, which is the second cross from the bottom, won't be a problem later on either. So as you can see, this is a gracious plenty string here for tying off a knot. Now that those are tucked out of the way, let's get started on the crosses. So I don't use a starting knot, I use a starting clamp. Now normally, again, I would just pull this to reach just the back of the gripper. But because we know that this is far more string than we really need for these crosses, I'll be luxurious today and actually go around the Diablo to the back of the gripper. And I'll have a lot of extra there. So that tail that I'm leaving now is about 3 inches longer because I'm incorporating the Diablo than I normally would leave. So we'll deduct that at the end when we're trying to figure out our absolute minimums. So as I said, this is 53 pounds both mains and crosses, so there's no need to change the setting on the machine now that we're doing the crosses. And as always, I'm weaving one ahead. This is one of the biggest reasons to use string from reels. You don't have all this coil memory to fight. Packs of string, especially polyester, always has all this coil memory that you have to fight. So when you cut string from reels, especially poly, it's always a blessing to not have to deal with all of this coil memory. At least, I should say, less coil memory. Sometimes when you get to the very end of a reel where it was more tightly wound, it's still a little bit of an issue, but by and large, you circumvent this problem. Okay, so unbeknownst to me, the battery on the camera died at some point while I was stringing. But to recap, basically what happened was when I finished stringing the mains, before tensioning the 8th outer mains, the string that was coming out of those grommets extended past the back of the gripper by 7.5 inches. It was actually 7.75 inches, but they're 7 3/4 inches, but let's just call it 7.5 to make the math easy. So I had 7.5 inches longer on this main, extra I should say, 7.5 extra inches on this side. So that's 7.5 inches and 7.5 inches. That's these two pieces here. So each of these were 7.5 inches longer than they needed to be. And remember, we started with 20 feet to begin with for our main. So that's 7.5 and 7.5 is 15 feet extra. We didn't need that 20-foot piece to be 20 feet long. It could have been 15 inches less, which would be 18 feet 9 inches, which if you go back to the beginning, I said normally when I string a 100 square inch racket with poly, I will often just cut 19 feet from the reel, sometimes 18 feet 9 inches. And that's exactly what this would require if I wanted the string to just reach the back of the gripper. Actually, I'd have a 1/4 of an inch extending past there and have something to hold on to. If I wanted to intentionally bridge to the tension head, using a starting clamp, those links could be even shorter. So those links I just mentioned would, if I cut a 18-foot 9-inch piece for the mains, my ends would reach the back of the gripper. But oftentimes I will cut string from reels shorter than that so that it does not actually reach the back of the gripper, knowing and planning to use this. As long as my string has got 8 or 9 inches here, long enough to comfortably tie my Parnell knots, I don't need the extra 3 inches or so, 3 or 4 inches to reach the back of the gripper. So sometimes, so for example, if I knew ahead of time that I was going to bridge to the tension head for both of my mains, instead of 18 feet 9 inches, I could probably do with 6 inches less. So I could cut 18 feet 3 inches from my reel and bridge each of those outer mains and still have enough to tie off. So I could conserve even more string if I wanted to. But if I wanted to actually reach the back of the tension head without bridging, 18 feet 9 inches would suffice. So that was for the mains. And then the crosses, this is from the top cross. Now my top cross, because I knew I was, to just refresh your memory, our crosses were 20 feet 2 inches. The set, brand new, measured out to 40 feet 2 inches. We cut 20 feet of that for the mains, leaving 20 feet 2 inches remaining for the crosses. So these pieces were what was remaining from the crosses. Now normally I set up my top cross to just reach the back of the tension head. Because I knew that this piece of string was going to be far longer than I really needed, I went ahead and was luxurious and made this string go around the Diablo and reach the back of the tension head. And going around my Diablo adds about 3 inches. So this piece is 3 inches longer than the bare minimum. Normally I just measure it to there. So ordinarily, I don't have to take into account anything on the top cross because I've pulled it to just reach before I get started on the crosses, and it's only what I have left over on the bottom cross that I need to take note of. But in this case, our top cross was 3 inches longer than we really needed it to be because I went around the diavolo. And the bottom cross, this piece, extended 26 inches past the back of the gripper, which means that our crosses, which were again 20 feet 2 inches to begin with, could be 26 inches plus another 3 inches less. So that's 29 inches less than what we started with. So if we take a calculator and we take 20 feet 2 inches, which would be 20.1666667, that's 20 feet 2 inches, and we subtract, if we multiply that times 12, that's 242 inches. So we started with 242 inches overall. 20 feet 2 inches is 242 inches. We subtract the 29 inches, that's the 26 inches from the bottom cross, plus the 3 additional inches that I put on the top cross, means that 213 inches are all that I really needed to reach the back of the tension head. And if we divide that by 12, it's 17.75 feet. So the crosses, I could pull just 17 feet 9 inches from the reel, and I would still be able to reach the back of the tension head doing the crosses. And again, if I wanted to bridge to my tension head, these links could be a little bit shorter. Probably 3 inches less on the top cross, 3 inches less on the bottom cross, so 6 inches less. So in reality, I could actually cut 17 feet 3 inches from my reel, or let's say I was at the very end of a reel and the remaining length that was on that reel was 17 feet 3 inches or 17 feet 5 inches. By this number, 17.75, it would seem that, I'm just short, I don't have enough to do the crosses. Actually, I could still do the crosses if I bridge the top cross and I bridge the bottom cross. I'd still have enough to tie off my knots. So to reach the back of the tension head, I would cut 17 feet 9 inches. But if I'm going to bridge both the top and bottom cross, I could get by with 17 feet 3 inches, no problem. So forget about bridging for a moment. 17.75 for the crosses, and if you recall, 18.75 for the mains. So if we take 18.75 and add that to the 18.75 for the mains, it's a total of 36.5 feet. So out of this 40-foot 2-inch long length of string, we really only needed 36.5 feet to reach the back of the tension head for all the pulls. 18 feet 9 inches and 17 feet 9 inches. So that's how you can save string or do the calculation to figure out how much you would need to pull from a reel, and you can use a set of string to make that determination. So I hope that helped you out. Thanks.